Hi, this is Jeff Daniels, and welcome to another edition of MasterVisualStudio.net. Today we'll be doing some work in Azure, setting up Azure Active Directory domain services. This is a pretty interesting offering in Azure that allows you to get the benefit of domain services for user authentication and domain management without having to spin up your own domain controls in the cloud or syncing to your on-premises Active Directory. We'll be touching on a number of different Azure offerings to pull this together, and once we're done, we'll have VMs on our domain with shared domain access across those machines. Now, all this in under 10 minutes or less. All right, let's get started setting up Active Directory domain services. Okay, we're over in the Azure portal now. And the first thing we'd like to do is, when I'm going to set up a test environment like this, two things I'll do is set up a dashboard. So if you just do new dashboard, name it whatever you'd like, just so you can kind of keep your resources in one spot that are easy to access. You can have your regular dashboard and your additional dashboards you create. And the second thing I'm going to do is create a resource group to keep all this, all the different pieces I'm going to build during this managed within one group. So when I'm done, I can delete them all easily and not have to go and hunt and peck and find the different pieces that were created all across the account. And we'll take a look too and see all the items that are in the resource group afterwards, just to see everything that does get created for a situation like this. So we'll create a new resource group called Active Directory Domain Services Test. And that should be created pretty quickly. Okay, so here's the Active Directory Domain Services Test resource group that we've created. And the next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and create a new virtual network where this domain service is going to actually reside in. So we'll click on New, Virtual Network. And let's give this a obvious name, ADDS Network. We'll put it in a 1016 namespace. And we'll use an existing resource group that we created in the last step. Subnet, just call this default subnet. And make this a 1024 enabled, pin it to our dashboard, and let's create it. So this is the default subnet where our VMs and things like that will reside in. We're also going to go ahead and create a second subnet, which is where the domain services are going to function. So let's go in and create that right now. We will go to subnets, add a second one, and this will be our domain services subnet. And this will be 1001. And this all looks good. All right, so now we've got our second subnet created. And let's go take a look at Active Directory. So when you created your Azure account, you've got a default Azure Active Directory created here. If you look at under domain names, you were probably given something along the lines of youraccount.onmicrosoft.com. That's going to be your domain name services. That's your domain that you'll end up with for user accounts. What I've done is I've added the second one from MasterVisualStudio.net, and in order to do that, it's fairly simple. You would just add your domain name over here, .net, and it'll prompt you to go over to your domain provider and add a TX or an MX record to verify that you do have ownership of that account. Once you do, this will allow you to verify it. So we'll just delete that because I don't need that. And then you'll come in here if you want this to be the domain name for your users on your account. So if they're going to log in as Jeff at MasterVisualStudio.net to get into a virtual machine or to have access to the domain services, you want to make this one the primary. And that's pretty straightforward. Click on this. If it's not the primary, you'll have this enabled. You'll be able to click on that button and that will make it your primary. Okay, so now we've got these pieces. Let's get this next piece started because this is going to take a little while. We're going to want to create a user account that's going to be the administrator account for our new domain. So I could use mine. I'm just going to create a new one called John Smith, jsmith at Master Visual Studio. Okay. So one of the things we'll need to do is, in order for Active Directory, this Azure Active Directory, to take this user and sync their passwords over to Active Directory domain services, this Active Directory has no way to give the new domain your existing credentials. So what'll happen is, once we create the domain services, we'll go over and the users will have to change their accounts. That'll generate the hashes that are used by Azure Active Directory, and that will sync over to the Active Directory domain services. Now that sync process can take 15, maybe 20 minutes. So that's one of the pieces we talked about where this is a little bit of a time-consuming process. So that's why we want to copy this password. We're going to go change their password once the Active Directory domain is set up, and that will propagate the password change over to the directory domain services. Okay, so now why don't we go ahead and get started on adding a new domain, Azure AD domain services. We'll go ahead and create that. And here you can see, what do we want to call the domain name? And we want this domain name to be mastervisualstudio.net. And the subscription, again, put this in the resource group that we created for this. The network, let's go pick the test network that we've set up. Now the subnet, let's put this over on the second subnet that we created specifically for the domain services. Click OK. Administrator group, let's pick our members. We'll go add a member. And we're going to take the John Smith. We'll take mine too. Okay, so there's our members. Say OK. Here's our summary. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll click this OK. Once we do this, we're probably going to have about an hour or so to wait before this is actually created. So we'll move on to some of the other steps in the meantime, but this is by far the most time-consuming part of this process. Okay, we're back at the Azure dashboard now that we've created. And it looks like our domain services, we're going to pin that to the dashboard. It says that that was created. Let's go take a look at that. Okay, so yes, it was created, and no, it's not ready. We're probably about halfway through. During that last pause was about a half hour or so, and we've probably got another half hour to go. We're going to continue to see that this is deploying for a little while, and then once we're done, once that's done, we'll come in and see that it allows us to do things like set up the DNS resolution for this domain, for the domain services. So in the meantime, that's okay. At least we've got that, and that's on our dashboard now. Once this does come back up, we're going to want to do something with these domain services. So why don't we go ahead and create a virtual machine or two that we can add on to our domain once it's ready. So we'll go over to virtual machines. Click on add. And in this case, I'm just going to add in 2 Windows machines. So we're going to take a Windows 2016 data center. We'll call this ADDS 1. And not that it matters much as far as cost goes, because these will be deleted pretty quickly, but I'm just going to make them standard hard drives. Put in your credentials. Now this is the administrator account. If you haven't worked much with these virtual machines in Azure, we're setting up the admin account for that specific virtual machine. So this machine won't be on a domain when we first create it. So this will be the administrative account to get into the domain, to remote desktop in, to get into the computer, to remote desktop in and do any configuration that we want to do prior to adding it to the domain. And we'll use our existing resource group. If you do have a Windows license and you're going to have this machine up for a while, great, check this box and save yourself some money. And for a size, we literally need the smallest boxes possible here. We're just going to spin these up for an example and then trash them. Okay, so we use managed disks. We'll put it on the network. We'll put it in the default subnet. Let's make sure we don't have the domain services subnet selected, so we want the default subnet. We'll get a new IP, get a new network service group, and we don't even need boot diagnostics on this. This will be a pretty short-lived VM. Okay, so we'll go ahead and create this machine. Looks like that's deploying, and while that's deploying, let's go make another one. So we'll just have two that can communicate with each other, add them both to the domain. So we're going to walk through these same steps again. VM2. And we'll just put this in the same resource group. And you'll see, as we're really starting to build up a lot of pieces here for this demonstration, or for different workloads you might do in Azure, it really does make a lot of sense to group these into resource groups, just to be able to find and either clear out or manage the resources more effectively. So here we're just taking the smallest machine again, no availability set. We'll just reuse that first network security group. Sorry, this one. Just take the first one, say new IP address, default subnet, no boot diagnostics, and we're good. Great. So now we've got those two machines that are out there that are being spun up for us. And once those are ready, I'm guessing those will still be ready before our domain services are ready. But once those are all set up, we'll go in and do a little bit of pre-configuration before we want to add these machines to the network anyways. And then at that point, we should be pretty close to having our domain services ready. So we'll check back in just a minute. Okay, we're back at the Azure dashboard. And as you can see, we've got our network set up. We've got VM1 is running, VM2 is running. And if we go over here to our Active Directory domain services and we click on that, you can see we've got a different screen now where this is actually completed and it's up and running. And it tells you here you've got a couple required steps that you need to do to finish configuring this. And the first one is we want to set up our DNS entries for this new domain service. So these two IP addresses here, we want to use those as our DNS servers. So we'll just copy the first one, click on Configure DNS Servers. We're not going to use the Azure provided DNS servers. We're going to use our domain service. So we'll do the first one here is for if we scroll back over, which I don't think it'll allow me to, we'll see that there were two. They gave us a 1.4 and a 1.5. So these two are now going to be our DNS servers, so we'll save that. And again, these two IP addresses came from right here. So if you just copy these, click on Configure, and then fill those in. These are if we want to take additional steps to sync our Azure Active Directory domain services with an on-premises. So that would certainly be another route you could go. And there's an AD, there's this other tool over here called Active Directory Connect, Azure AD Connect right here, to sync with on-prem. We're not going to do that. But there is one other thing that it's mentioning that I want to point out to you. So for cloud only, which is what we're doing here, there's still one more step before our user passwords will be enabled and synced across from Active Directory, Azure Active Directory over to domain services. And like I mentioned, that is the step of changing your password so that once it's changed, Active Directory sees that and it syncs it over to domain services. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a new incognito tab, and we're going to do this for earlier in this process. We had an Azure Active Directory user that we created, J Smith, which is right here. And for this user, we're going to go change their password so that it'll sync over to domain services, and then we can log in with that account once we add these VMs to the domain. And we'll actually use this account also to add these VMs onto the domain. Okay, so the address to do this is at microsoft.com. That's actually my apps.microsoft.com. And you'll see when you first come over, it sets it up to my current account that I'm logged into Azure on. We will sign out from that. And we will log in with jsmith at mastervisualstudio.net. And I save this password over here. So this was the temporary password that was generated. And the first time that you log in, it'll actually prompt you to change this, which is perfect because we want to change our password for this user so that it'll sync over. So we'll sign in, and it says I need to update my password. So we'll put in the temporary one. And then we'll give it a new password. Okay. Update password and sign in. Now, this is another case where you really got to be patient, because if you try to log into the domain anytime within the next 10, 15 minutes, it's very likely it's not going to sync over there and you're going to start looking for what went wrong somewhere. But it really is a just be patient scenario here where you just have to wait it out and eventually it'll propagate over. It is a little bit of a slow process. I'm going to sign out from that. And pretty sure it logged me out of this. Nope, there we go. All right, so I'm still here with these two accounts. So now we've gone ahead and changed our account password, so that will need to sync over to domain services. That'll take a little bit of time, but let's go take a look at the VMs that we have. So if we go over to VM1 and we'll connect to it. So once you download the connection profile for this remote desktop, you can go in and change some of this. I'm just going to change the display to bring it out of full screen so it's easier for us to see. And that all looks good. And again, this was the account that we created when we made the VM. This is not the domain account. All right, so here's our new machine. First thing I want to do, after I close that, is to go over, we'll take a look at our server. So if we wanted to add this to the domain account, to the Active Directory domain services now, we could click on this. And I want to show you this because I don't think the password information is propagated over yet. So you may see this, and I just want to prepare you for that so you don't think something's gone wrong if you do see this error. So if I go to the domain, okay. Now you're obviously not going to put that in. You're going to put in the onmicrosoft.com or whatever the different domain you use when you configured your Active Directory domain services. So let's see what this says. Okay, so this tells me that it can't be contacted. And when that happens, that tells me that the domain services have spun up and they're running. However, this machine was already up and running and had acquired all its routing and DNS prior to those services being ready. So if we come over here and we restart this one, say it's planned. And at the same time, why don't we go over to our second virtual machine and do the same thing. We'll restart that. And we can do that from right here. Okay, so I'm going to connect back over to that first virtual machine now. And really what we're trying to show here is that there's a couple issues you may run into along the way that aren't really issues. We're going to do the server restart, which should get us back on the domain once we got through that first error where it couldn't find it. After a restart, it should be there. And the second one is, I'm guessing my credentials still haven't propagated over, so even once it does find the domain, we still may have an issue actually adding this VM to the domain until that happens. So let's take a look at that. All right, so we'll go over to the local server tab once again, and we'll click on workgroup, and we want to change this to be in our domain. Great, so after the reboot now, we can see that we've actually got our Active Directory domain services up and running, and it was able to find them, and now it's asking for the account that will have the privileges to add this to the domain, this VM. So as I said, I want to use that jsmith@mastervisualstudio.net. And I would not be surprised if it told me that the password was wrong here. And generally what that's telling me now is it still has not propagated over. So do not fear. It'll be there soon. What you don't want to do is start changing things to figure out why it's not working. Very likely in this case that it's only because it hasn't propagated over. So we're going to give it a few more minutes and then we'll try again. All right, so we've waited a little longer. Let's take another look to see if we're all set to join this VM to the domain now. There we go. So absolutely, patience is your friend on this one. I had parked this for about another 45 minutes. For that to propagate. It usually doesn't take that long. I've seen it take mostly about 15 to 20 minutes, but really just so you guys know, if you're seeing that password error, don't start resetting your password again. Try to change it again. It's only going to slow down the process. It will propagate over. It just takes a little bit of time. So we'll say OK. And we're going to need to do a reboot on this machine. All right, I'm just going to go over and connect to this second machine now. And we'll go add that one to the domain. Now let's see, so we'll go over to local services. This is all great. We'll click on workgroup. Now at this point, this one should have propagated over the same way and been ready. So mastervisualstudio.net. Remember to leave off the .com or .net off of that. And make sure you type in your password correctly. All right, second machine added to the domain. Making a little more progress. This one's going to restart. I'm going to jump back over to our first machine now, and it should be on the domain. We're logging in with a local user account, not as a domain account. And there's just a couple things I want to look at real quick just to show you before we use a domain account. So if we go to Tools, Computer Manager, it's a one-core machine, so it's going to be a little slow. And if we go over to groups, administrators, you'll see all the domain admins have been added to the administrator group, and my account has been added to the domain managers group. What we don't have in the administrators group is, and again here I'm trying to add the Active Directory Domain Services Administrators group to this, and in order to do that, it needs to search through the mastervisualstudio.net domain, and in order to do that, I need to put in my domain user credentials. This way. Oh, actually it already has the domain. Okay. We say find now, and the account that we're looking for that gets automatically created is this one right here, Azure Active Directory Domain Controller Administrators. This is the domain services account that gets created. So we want that in the admin group. And then what we want to do, and this is on our first VM, so we will disconnect as our local user, and we'll connect with our domain user account, which is going to be this one. And notice here that I'm using the format of jsmith@mastervisualstudio.net as opposed to the mastervisualstudio.net or mastervisualstudio/jsmith. And then we should be able to put in our password and connect to the machine. So by putting that Active Directory account into the administrators group, that allowed us to also be able to remote desktop with these accounts. So it'll take just a minute for these to come up. Put this down here. Okay, one final piece here that we want to do. We've got both the machines added to the domain. That's great. We want to go in and be able to work with Active Directory and domain services, but we don't have a domain controller. So what we need to do there is, now that we've logged in with an administrator account on the machine and an Active Directory administrator account, we're going to come in and go to add a new feature for this machine. So we're just going to roles and features, go all the way down to features, and since we don't have a regular domain controller, we need to go in and add remote server administration tools, and we want to add this, Active Directory Domain Services and Active Directory LDS tools. Okay, and installation is completed there. I paused that. There was probably took about 2 minutes there to complete that installation, but if we close that and we go over to tools, here we go, Active Directory Administrative Center. So now we can remotely administer all these Active Directory domain services directly from one of our machines, even without having our own domain controller. So nice little benefit there. We can close that. We can go look at all the users that are in this, users and computers. So if we go in and look at our domain and we look at our users, there's John Smith, there's my account. That's the Active Directory Administrator group. Now, one note here that I'd like to point out is we're not going to be adding a new group here or new users here. If you want to add them, you add them. This is kind of a one-way sync. So if you want to add them, you add them through the Azure portal under Azure Active Directory and add user, add group. And when you do that, it works very similar to what we just saw, where it's going to take 15-20 minutes to propagate over the new groups. May take a little longer, but about that much time. But you're not going to add them through this interface. This is really for going in and reviewing, okay, what computers are on the domain. We can see both of our computers are there that we've added. Here's our users, and then you can add additional groups through the Azure portal and then put users in those groups, so everybody obviously isn't coming in as an administrator. So that being said, the last thing I'd like to show you is, let me just disconnect from this. back at our portal, and if we go look at our resource group, this is everything we've got added by doing this. You can see I created 2 network cards for the domain services, along with a load balancer, a public IP address for that. Here's our Active Directory domain services network that we created. We've got 2 virtual machines. Here's machine 1 and its disk, network interface and IP and a network security group. Second machine, that disk, network interface, IP, and here is our domain. So very quickly, if you wanted to get rid of all that, click all this, or just actually delete the resource group, and you could remove all of that in one fell swoop, which is another reason why you really, aside from what we did today, think about using resource groups. It really helps keep things a little bit cleaner. But that's it. We've got the domain. It's up there. It's validating users. We can add additional users that way, and now you don't have a bunch of virtual machines with local service accounts or local user accounts across, 5, 10 different VMs. There is another whole piece to this where you can sync this with your on-prem Active Directory. You can absolutely do that. That's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about today, but it absolutely is an option with this feature also. So that's it. I hope you found this to be helpful and a nice introduction to how to set this up. Probably the main thing to keep in mind here is it does take time for a lot of these services to be set up, and don't lose hope if it looks like it's not working, if the passwords just haven't propagated over, or the groups haven't, or it's taken a long time for the domain services to spin up. That's just part of this process. Okay, it took us a little while to get there, but we ended up with a new Azure Active Directory domain service up and running with a couple VMs on it and a user that was able to connect and authenticate against that service. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop those below, or you can reach me directly at jeff@mastervisualstudio.net, and we'll see you in the next video.